The whispers followed her like autumn leaves caught in an unrelenting wind, swirling through the narrow cobblestone streets of Ashford, a small industrial town nestled in the shadows of Yorkshire's textile mills, where smoke from countless chimneys painted the morning sky in shades of grey that matched the judgmental stares of its inhabitants. Claire Weston kept her gaze fixed determinedly on the worn stones beneath her feet, her worn leather boots clicking against the uneven pavement with a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing during these past 3 weeks of public scrutiny and private doubt, clutching her wicker sewing basket closer to her chest as though it might serve as shield against the cruelty that seemed to seep from every doorway and shop window. She passed on her way to the modest cottage at the edge of town, where her new husband lay, in what everyone believed to be his final days. "There she goes," came Mrs. Pemberton's voice, deliberately pitched loud enough to carry across the morning air from the doorway of the millinery shop, where the woman stood arranging ribbons in the display window with hands that trembled slightly from age and perhaps from the excitement of having fresh gossip to share with anyone who might pause long enough to listen. The foolish seamstress who accepted a dying man's proposal, throwing away her youth on a sickly stranger with no prospects and no family, no history that anyone can verify or understand. Rather, Claire quickened her pace despite the burning sensation in her cheeks that signalled her humiliation was visible for all to see, though she had grown somewhat accustomed to such cruel observations during her 25 years of life in Ashford, a town that had never been particularly kind to those who defied its rigid expectations or challenged its carefully maintained social hierarchy. At 25, she occupied that awkward space between youth and spinsterhood, old enough to be considered past her prime by the standards of a community that valued early marriages and conventional choices, yet young enough that her acceptance of Mr. Gabriel Ashworth's extraordinary proposal had been deemed not merely foolish, but actively scandalous by those who claimed to care about her welfare, while secretly delighting in having new material for their endless conversations about other people's failures and misfortune. She turned onto Willow Lane, where the modest workers' cottages stood in stark architectural contrast to the grand townhouses on the hill overlooking Ashford's prosperous commercial district, their weathered facades and small windows speaking of lives lived within careful economic constraints that allowed for survival but rarely for comfort or beauty. Her destination was the smallest cottage at the very end of the lane, a structure so unassuming that it might have been overlooked entirely were it not for the neat condition of its exterior and the carefully tended window boxes that held the last struggling blooms of summer, evidence of someone's determination to maintain dignity despite reduced circumstance and uncertain future. The arrangement that had scandalized Ashford's society had been simple enough in its basic terms, though complex in all its implications and potential consequences. Mr. Gabriel Ashworth, a gentleman of indeterminate origins, who had arrived in Ashford 6 months prior seeking the clean Yorkshire air that physicians sometimes recommended for consumptive patients, had fallen gravely ill with what the local doctor had diagnosed as an advanced deterioration of the lungs that would certainly prove fatal within a matter of weeks or at most a few months. With no family to care for him during his final days, no servants to attend to his needs, and his condition deteriorating with alarming rapidity, despite the supposed benefits of country air and simple living, he had made Claire an unexpected offer that had initially seemed so outrageous that she had laughed, thinking it must be some kind of dark jest born of fever or delirium. Marriage, he had proposed in his quiet, cultured voice, that seemed incongruous, coming from a man supposedly dying of consumption, with the promise that she would inherit his modest savings upon his seemingly imminent death, funds he claimed would be sufficient to provide her with security for several years, if managed carefully, perhaps even enough to allow her to leave Ashford entirely and start fresh in some larger city where her past would not follow her like an accusatory shadow. In return for this financial security, she would provide companionship during his final weeks or months, would sit with him during the long evenings when loneliness weighed most heavily, would read to him when his strength failed, and would ensure that he did not die alone and unmourned in this town, where he knew no one, and where no one had shown any inclination to know him, beyond the most superficial courtesies that he required. What had possessed her to accept this bizarre proposal remained something of a mystery even to Claire herself, though she had spent considerable time during sleepless nights attempting to understand the impulses that had led her to say yes, when every rational consideration suggested she should have fled immediately from such an inappropriate suggestion. Perhaps it was the memory of her own father's lonely death 5 years earlier, when he had wasted away from similar consumption, while she had watched helplessly, unable to afford the medicines or treatments that might have eased his suffering, unable to provide anything beyond her presence and her tears, as he slipped away from her in their cramped rooms above the tailor's shop he had worked until his illness made even the simple act of threading a needle impossible. Or perhaps it was the crushing weight of poverty that had threatened to consume her entirely since losing her position at Madame Laurent's exclusive dress shop 3 months ago, dismissed because one of the proprietress's favoured clients had taken offence at something Claire had supposedly said, though she could never determine what transgression she had actually committed beyond existing as someone of lower status who dared to have opinions about fabric and design. Or perhaps, and this was the possibility that troubled her most during those sleepless nights, it was something she had glimpsed in Mr. Gabriel Ashworth's eyes during their first meeting, those remarkable grey eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and feeling that his frail appearance and weakened condition could not entirely obscure, eyes that burned with an intensity suggesting that whatever illness ravaged his body had not yet touched his mind or spirit, that beneath the surface presentation of a dying man lay someone far more complex and interesting than his circumstances would suggest. As she approached his cottage door on this particular morning, the mist still clinging to the bare branches of the willow trees that gave the lane its name, Claire smoothed her simple brown woolen dress, a practical garment that had seen better days, but which remained serviceable for her reduced circumstance, though it was a pitiful creation compared to the elaborate silk gowns she had once crafted for Ashford's elite ladies during her employment at the dress shop, when her skilled fingers had created beauty for others to wear, while she herself made do with whatever fabric remained after the paying customers had made their selections. She raised her hand to knock, her knuckles poised against the weathered wood, but the door opened before she could make contact, as though he had been waiting just inside, anticipating her arrival, with an eagerness that seemed touching, given the formal nature of their arrangement and the practical motivations that had brought them together. "Mrs. Ashworth," came the deep voice of Gabriel Ashworth, still weakened by his illness, but possessing a timbre that suggested education and refinement far beyond what one might expect from someone living in such modest circumstance in a working-class district of a small industrial town. He stood leaning heavily on a plain wooden walking stick that bore no decorative carving or silver handle such as a gentleman might typically carry, his tall frame diminished somewhat by the illness that had stripped away whatever robust health he might once have possessed, yet still managing to convey an impression of natural authority and dignity that transcended his reduced physical state. His dark hair, touched with silver at the temples in a way that suggested he might be older than his relatively unlined face would indicate, was neatly combed despite the early hour, and his simple clothing, while made of inexpensive materials appropriate to his supposed station, was immaculately maintained and properly fitted in ways that suggested either previous experience with better circumstances or natural fastidiousness about personal presentation. "Mr. Ashworth," she replied, executing a small curtsy that their new relationship as husband and wife technically rendered unnecessary, but which she found herself performing anyway out of some combination of habit, respect, and uncertainty about how to navigate the strange territory of a marriage that existed in name and legal document, but had not yet developed the informal ease that might allow them to dispense with such formality. She noticed, as she often did when seeing him, how the morning light filtering through the doorway accentuated the unusual pallor of his skin, that translucent quality that consumption supposedly imparted to its victims, though there was something about the clarity of his gaze and the steadiness of his posture that seemed inconsistent with someone genuinely at death's threshold. "I've brought the linens I promised to mend," she continued, lifting her basket slightly to indicate the clean white fabric folded carefully within, along with her sewing supplies and the small treats she had taken to bringing him. Simple things like fresh bread from the baker, who still extended her credit, or apples from the market vendor, who pitied her enough to slip her the occasional piece of fruit that was slightly past its prime, but still perfectly edible, and some items for your comfort. He stepped aside to allow her entry into the cottage's small but scrupulously clean interior, and Claire felt the familiar flutter in her chest that occurred whenever she found herself in his presence, a sensation she had initially attributed to simple compassion for his suffering, but which had gradually evolved into something more complex and difficult to name, something that made her simultaneously eager to see him and anxious about what those feelings might mean for her carefully maintained emotional distance. The cottage consisted of only 3 rooms, the main living area where they now stood, a small bedroom barely large enough to contain a narrow bed and a chest of drawers, and a tiny kitchen that was more alcove than actual room. Yet everything was arranged with meticulous care, each item in its proper place, the modest furniture positioned to maximize the limited space available, the few books he possessed stacked neatly on a small shelf near the window where natural light would facilitate reading during the day. What struck Claire most forcefully, as it had during every previous visit, was the notable absence of personal items that might provide insight into Gabriel's life before Ashford. No family portraits or daguerreotypes, no letters from relatives or friends, no decorative objects that might indicate previous residence in some specific location or connection to any particular community or social circle. It was as though he had materialized in Ashford fully formed, but without history, a man whose past had been deliberately erased or carefully concealed, leaving only the present moment and the uncertain future that his illness seemed determined to cut short before it had properly begun. "You needn't have walked through the town centre," he said quietly, closing the door against not just the morning chill, but also against the prying eyes of neighbours who monitored the comings and goings on Willow Lane with the dedication of paid informants, their curtains twitching aside whenever anyone passed, their gossip spreading through Ashford with impressive speed and disturbing accuracy. The garden path along the mill stream would have spared you their cruelty and brought you here by a more pleasant route through the countryside. Claire placed her basket on the small wooden table that served as both dining surface and workspace, the only substantial piece of furniture in the main room beyond the 2 simple chairs and the narrow shelf that held his books. "And give them the satisfaction of thinking I am ashamed of our arrangement, that I slink about like a criminal avoiding detection." "I think not, sir." Her voice carried more defiance than she typically allowed herself to display. But something about Gabriel's presence made her feel that she could speak honestly, without fear of judgment or reprimand, that he understood the complicated mixture of pride and vulnerability that motivated her decisions, even when those decisions seemed foolish to outside observers. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his austere features briefly into something approaching warmth or perhaps amusement at her stubborn insistence on maintaining dignity in the face of communal disapproval. "You possess remarkable courage, Mrs. Ashworth. More courage than most would demonstrate in similar circumstances." "Not courage, Mr. Ashworth," she replied, beginning to unpack her basket and spread the linens across the table surface, avoiding his penetrating gaze because direct eye contact with him always seemed to create a kind of intensity that left her feeling exposed in ways she found both thrilling and deeply uncomfortable. Necessity. When one has few choices available, the selection of any particular path appears less like courage and more like simple recognition of limited options. Ah! The banns were read for the final time this past Sunday, she continued, her fingers smoothing wrinkles from the fabric with practiced efficiency born of years spent working with textiles, understanding instinctively how cloth should drape and fold, how to coax beauty from even the most ordinary materials through patience and skill. Our arrangement will be made official by week's end, assuming you still wish to proceed with the ceremony. And you are certain? His voice held an unexpected tension, as though her answer mattered in ways that extended beyond the practical terms of their agreement. There is still time to reconsider if you have any doubts. I would not hold you to a promise made under circumstances that might have seemed less daunting when we first discussed them than they appear now that the actual moment approaches. I have made my decision, Claire interrupted, finally meeting his gaze directly and finding there something that made her breath catch in her throat, some combination of hope and vulnerability that seemed at odds with his usual careful composure and measured responses to emotional situations. Unless you yourself wish to withdraw your offer, unless you have reconsidered and decided that perhaps you would prefer to face your final days alone rather than burdened with a wife whose presence might prove more troublesome than comforting. Something flashed in those grey depths, some powerful emotion that might have been relief, or perhaps determination, some feeling too complex to reduce to a single word or simple interpretation. No, he said quietly, with an emphasis that suggested the syllable carried weight far beyond its brevity or simplicity. I do not wish to withdraw. I very much for you to become my wife, Mrs. Weston, soon to be Mrs. Ashworth in truth rather than merely in anticipation. Thanks. As Claire spread the linens across the table and began her mending work, her needle moving with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years perfecting her craft, neither of them could have anticipated how their unusual arrangement would soon evolve in ways that would shock not only the judgmental residents of Ashford, but would fundamentally transform both of their lives in directions neither had imagined possible when Gabriel had first proposed this marriage of convenience that was beginning to feel like something else entirely, something neither practical nor convenient, but rather necessary in ways that had nothing to do with financial security or fear of dying alone. 3 days after their modest wedding ceremony, conducted by a reluctant minister in the small parish church, with only his disapproving wife serving as witness to their unconventional union, Claire stood at the cottage window, watching raindrops trace intricate patterns down the glass panes, each drop following its own meandering path downward, as though searching for the most interesting route to the windowsill below. The whispers that had followed her through Ashford streets had evolved from mere speculation and disapproval into open ridicule and active contempt, as though her actual marriage to Gabriel had somehow made her transgression more offensive than the mere prospect of such a marriage had been during the weeks when the banns were being read, and the community still held out hope that she might come to her senses and withdraw from the arrangement before it was too late to avoid scandal. That very morning at the market, where she had gone to purchase the few necessities their limited budget would allow, Lady Harrington's youngest daughter had laughed outright when the market vendor had addressed Claire by her new married name, the girl's hand flying to her mouth in a theatrical gesture of mock surprise that fooled no one about the deliberate nature of her cruelty. "Such a pity," the young woman had said, her voice carrying clearly through the market square as she examined a bolt of imported silk that her family's wealth rendered easily affordable, while Claire could only look at such luxuries with the wistful recognition of someone who understood quality but lacked the means to possess it, to sell oneself so cheaply, to throw away any hope of a proper match for the sake of a few months of playing nursemaid to a dying stranger. Behind her, in the cottage's small front room, Gabriel coughed, the sound rattling in his chest with the wet, laboured quality that physicians associated with advanced consumption, the kind of cough that portended imminent death and made witnesses instinctively step backward as though illness might be contagious through mere proximity to its sufferer. Claire turned quickly from the window, her reflections on the morning's humiliations immediately displaced by more pressing concern for her husband's immediate well-being, though she noticed with some confusion that in the fortnight since their marriage, his condition had shown no signs of either improving or worsening, maintaining instead a curious plateau that seemed inconsistent with the doctor's dire predictions of rapid decline and imminent demise. "Shall I prepare your tonic?" she asked, moving swiftly to his side where he sat in the room's single armchair positioned near the small hearth, where a modest fire burned with carefully measured fuel, for coal was expensive and their resources limited despite Gabriel's claims of having modest savings set aside for his final expenses and her inheritance. Dr. Matthews left instructions for the dosage and timing. "Not yet," Gabriel said, and his hand reached out to capture hers with surprising warmth and unexpected strength for someone supposedly wasting away from consumption, his fingers wrapping around her smaller hand with gentle but definite pressure that sent an odd sensation up her arm and into her chest. "Sit with me for a while. I find your company more restorative than any medicine the good doctor might prescribe," Claire complied, settling carefully onto the footstool beside his chair, close enough to be companionable, but maintaining enough distance to preserve the boundaries that their arrangement seemed to require, though she had begun to wonder lately whether those boundaries were necessary, or whether they might be artificial constraints imposed by her own uncertainty about how to navigate a relationship that had begun as pure transaction, but seemed to be evolving into something that resembled actual companionship, perhaps even the beginnings of genuine affection. This strange intimacy had developed between them during the weeks since their wedding, not the passionate romance that novels described or the physical desire that young women whispered about behind closed doors, but rather a quiet understanding and mutual regard that offered unexpected comfort to them both, as though each had found in the other something they had been seeking without quite realizing they were searching. "You received another invitation," she said, nodding toward the cream-colored envelope that rested on the narrow mantel above the fireplace, its expensive paper and formal penmanship standing in stark contrast to the cottage's humble surroundings. "From Lord Blackwood. His annual autumn hunt begins next week, and apparently he wishes you to attend, though I cannot imagine how you would manage such an activity given your current state of health." A shadow crossed Gabriel's face, so quickly that Claire might have imagined it if she had not been watching him closely, a fleeting expression of something that might have been concern or perhaps calculation, as though the invitation represented complications he had hoped to avoid. "How peculiar," he said after a moment's pause, his tone carefully neutral in a way that made Claire suspect he found the invitation anything but peculiar, that he understood its significance in ways he was choosing not to share with her. "I have never attended any of Lord Blackwood's social functions, or made any effort to cultivate his acquaintance. Perhaps he merely seeks to complete his collection of Ashford residents, to ensure that no one living within his domain, however temporarily or marginally, remains outside the sphere of his social influence and baronial authority. Or to observe the spectacle of our marriage first-hand," Claire replied with a trace of bitterness she rarely allowed herself to display, though her frustration with Ashford's persistent judgment had been building steadily throughout the weeks of public censure and private doubt. To see for himself what manner of desperate woman would marry a dying stranger for the sake of whatever modest inheritance he might leave behind, to confirm all the gossip and speculation that has made us the primary topic of conversation in every drawing-room and shop in this wretched town. Gabriel's expression softened, and what might have been genuine concern replaced the momentary shadow that had crossed his features at the mention of Lord Blackwood's invitation. "Does it trouble you greatly?" What they say? The whispers and judgments and deliberate cruelties? Claire considered this question seriously, her fingers absently tracing the simple gold wedding band that now encircled her finger, the ring that had belonged to Gabriel's first wife, according to the story he had told. Though she had noticed there were no other remnants of that previous marriage anywhere in the cottage, no portraits or personal items that might provide evidence of the woman who had supposedly worn this ring before her. "Not for myself," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "I have endured worse than gossip during my years in Ashford, but I dislike their assumption that I married you purely for financial gain, as though I am incapable of ordinary human compassion, or as though the only possible motivation for accepting your proposal must be mercenary self-interest rather than simple kindness to someone facing death alone. Is that why you agreed to marry me, Gabriel?" His voice dropping to a quieter register that seemed to create a bubble of intimacy despite the modest surroundings and the rain drumming steadily against the window. Simple compassion for a dying man. The question hung between them, weighted with implications and unspoken possibilities that Claire found herself reluctant to examine too closely, for to acknowledge that her motivations might have included elements beyond compassion would require admitting feelings she was not yet prepared to name or claim. Before she could formulate a response that would be both honest and self-protective, a sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation, startling them both and causing Gabriel to withdraw his hand from hers with a speed that suggested the contact had been somehow improper despite their married status. Claire rose and moved to the door, smoothing her dress and checking that her hair remained neatly pinned despite the morning's activities, aware that whoever stood outside would be observing her carefully and reporting their observations throughout Ashford before the day ended. She opened the door to find Mr. Harrison, the town's banker, standing in the rain with an expression of profound discomfort creasing his usually composed features, his expensive coat darkening with moisture as he shifted his weight from foot to foot in a manner most unlike his typical dignified bearing. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, clearly struggling with the necessity of addressing her by her married name, the title sitting awkwardly on his tongue, as though it violated some natural order that he felt compelled to resist, even while acknowledging its legal validity. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I must speak with your husband regarding an urgent matter that has arisen, a matter that requires immediate attention and cannot wait for more convenient circumstance." Gabriel appeared beside Claire with surprising swiftness for someone supposedly weakened by consumption, his posture straightening in a way she had not witnessed before, his entire bearing shifting subtly to convey an authority that seemed inconsistent with his stated position as a gentleman of modest means facing imminent death. "Mr. Harrison," he acknowledged, his voice taking on a quality of command that made the banker instinctively straighten his own posture, as though responding to superior rank or station. "This is indeed unexpected. What matter brings you to my door in such inclement weather?" The banker glanced meaningfully at Claire, his expression suggesting that he preferred to discuss whatever urgent business had brought him through the rain in private, without feminine ears to hear matters he clearly considered inappropriate for a woman's understanding or involvement. "It concerns correspondence I have received from London," Harrison said carefully, "regarding certain financial accounts and arrangements that require your immediate signature and verification, matters of some delicacy that perhaps should be discussed without—" "My wife may hear whatever you have come to say," Gabriel interrupted firmly, his hand moving to rest at the small of Claire's back in a gesture that was simultaneously protective and proprietary, claiming her right to be included in discussions that others might wish to conduct in her absence. "We have no secrets between us, Mr. Harrison, and anything you wish to communicate to me may be communicated in her presence without concern for impropriety or indiscretion." Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to proceed, when his preferred course of excluding Claire from the discussion had been explicitly rejected by the man he needed to consult. "Very well, sir. I have received urgent communication from Barrister and Company, the prestigious London solicitors who apparently manage certain substantial holdings and investments on your behalf, though I confess I am somewhat confused by their inquiries, as I was not previously aware of your connection to such an established firm, or your possession of the considerable assets they reference in their correspondence." A charged silence filled the small cottage, the only sound the steady rhythm of rain against the roof and the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth. Claire felt Gabriel stiffen beside her, his hand at her back pressing slightly more firmly, as though he needed the physical connection to steady himself against whatever revelation or complication Harrison's news represented. When Gabriel finally spoke, his voice carried an unfamiliar note of something that might have been authority, or perhaps simply careful control of a situation that threatened to spiral beyond his management. "I believe there has been some confusion, Mr. Harrison," Gabriel said smoothly, though Claire detected a current of tension beneath his composed surface. "I have no dealings with the Barrister and Company that I am aware of. Perhaps there is another gentleman of similar name who maintains accounts with your bank, and the London firm has simply confused our identities in their correspondence." Harrison produced a folded letter from inside his damp coat, the paper bearing an impressive wax seal that Claire recognized even from a distance as the kind employed by very wealthy or aristocratic families, the sort of thing she had seen occasionally when delivering finished garments to the homes of Ashford's elite clients during her employment at the dress shop. "They were quite specific in their inquiries, sir," the banker said, his tone suggesting polite skepticism about Gabriel's claim of confusion or mistaken identity. "They reference holdings inherited from the late Duke of Thornwood, and they require your signature on documents transferring certain properties and investments into your direct control, matters that cannot be delayed much longer without creating legal complications." The name struck Claire with almost physical force. Duke of Thornwood, one of England's oldest and most distinguished titles, associated with vast estates in 3 counties and a fortune that made even Ashford's wealthiest residents appear relatively modest by comparison. She turned to look at Gabriel, questions forming on her lips, even as her mind struggled to process the implications of what Harrison had just revealed. But the expression on her husband's face silenced her immediate impulse to demand explanation or clarification. For just a moment, before his features settled back into their usual careful neutrality, she glimpsed something beneath the facade of the invalid gentleman seeking refuge in a small Yorkshire town, a flicker of the man he might truly be when not maintaining the fiction of terminal illness and reduced circumstances. "As I said," Gabriel replied, his voice now carrying unmistakable tones of aristocratic authority that made even the banker take an involuntary step backward, "there has been some confusion. Perhaps you might write to the Barrister and Company and inform them that they have contacted the wrong Gabriel Ashworth, that the man they seek does not reside in this modest cottage in Ashford, but must be found elsewhere, in whatever grand estate or London townhouse such a person would properly inhabit." Harrison seemed unconvinced but nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation and uncertain how to proceed when confronted with denials that contradicted documentary evidence from one of London's most reputable legal firms. "As you say, sir, though I must tell you that the similarity of names and the specificity of their inquiries make it seem a remarkable coincidence, but I shall communicate your response and trust that the matter will be resolved through proper channels." After the banker departed, pulling his coat more tightly against the rain as he hurried back toward the town centre, where no doubt his strange conversation would fuel additional speculation and gossip, Claire turned to Gabriel with questions burning on her tongue and confusion clouding her usually clear thoughts. She had married this man barely 2 weeks ago, had accepted his proposal and his promises based on the limited information he had chosen to share. And now she found herself wondering whether anything he had told her bore any relationship to truth, or whether their entire arrangement had been built upon deceptions she was only beginning to glimpse. "Gabriel," she began carefully, using his given name with an intimacy that their brief marriage had not yet fully established, but which the gravity of the moment seemed to require. "What was Mr. Harrison speaking about? Why would London solicitors be writing to you about ducal inheritances and substantial holdings?" "Nothing of consequence," he answered, but his hand trembled slightly where it gripped the walking stick that he suddenly seemed to need for support after having stood throughout the banker's visit without apparent difficulty, and his voice carried less conviction than usual, as though even he recognized that the words sounded hollow and unconvincing. "Merely a case of mistaken identity, as I told Harry. There must be another Gabriel Ashworth somewhere in England, perhaps someone of actual consequence and standing, and the solicitors have simply confused our names in their correspondence." Claire wanted to believe him, wanted to accept his explanation, and return to the comfortable understanding they had been developing during their brief marriage. But something in his eyes, and in the way he avoided meeting her direct gaze, suggested that truth was far more complicated than simple mistaken identity, that the banker's visit had cracked open a door Gabriel had been trying desperately to keep closed. That night, as rain continued its assault on the cottage windows, and wind howled through the narrow streets of Ashford, like some wounded creature seeking shelter, Claire lay awake in her small bedroom that adjoined Gabriel's through a thin wall, their arrangement maintaining strict propriety despite their married status, their relationship remaining one of companionship and mutual regard, rather than physical intimacy or passionate connection. Yet for the first time since accepting his proposal, she found herself questioning not merely the details of Gabriel's history or the truth of his claimed circumstances, but the fundamental nature of the arrangement she had entered, wondering whether she had married not just a dying man seeking comfort in his final weeks, but a man harboring secrets that could either destroy the fragile peace she had found in their unusual union or transform her life in ways she could not yet imagine or predict. In the adjacent room, Gabriel Ashworth also remained wakeful, his thoughts consumed not by the illness that supposedly ravaged his body, but by the decision that loomed before him with increasing urgency, whether to maintain the carefully constructed fiction that had allowed him to escape the burdens of his true identity, or whether to risk everything by revealing the truth to the remarkable woman who had become his wife, knowing that such revelation might either drive her away in justified anger at his deceptions, or might open possibilities for genuine connection that transcended the practical arrangement they had initially negotiated. A fortnight later, Claire stood frozen in the doorway of Gabriel's small bedroom, her heart pounding with a mixture of guilt over her trespass and shock at what she had discovered. A silver letter opener clutched uselessly in her trembling hand, as though she might need it for protection against the truths that lay scattered before her in documentary form. She had not intended to invade his privacy, had merely been searching for sealing wax to finish a letter to her sister, when she had noticed that one of the drawers in the modest writing desk he kept near his window stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of what appeared to be official correspondence bearing seals and markings that seemed far too grand for a man of humble circumstances facing imminent death in a small Yorkshire cottage. Her fingers had moved almost of their own volition, pulling the drawer fully open before rational caution could stop her, and there before her lay a stack of letters and documents that confirmed everything she had begun to suspect since Mr. Harrison's visit, but had been afraid to voice aloud or even acknowledge in her private thoughts. The correspondence was addressed not to Mr. Gabriel Ashworth, gentleman of modest means, seeking country air for his failing health, but rather to His Grace, Gabriel Ashworth, Duke of Thornwood, and it came from London solicitors, estate managers, members of Parliament, and various titled individuals whose names Claire recognised from newspaper accounts of important social events and political proceedings that shaped England's governance and commerce. "I see you have discovered my secret," came Gabriel's deep voice from behind her. no longer weakened by the cough that had been his constant companion during the weeks of their acquaintance, no longer marked by the tremor of terminal illness or the breathlessness of failing lungs. Claire whirled to find him standing in the doorway of his bedroom, his posture entirely transformed from the stooped invalid stance he had maintained so carefully during their marriage, his tall frame now fully upright and commanding in ways that had been concealed beneath layers of deliberate weakness and strategic fragility. He leaned still on his walking stick, but the gesture seemed more habitual than necessary, and there was a vitality to his complexion and a strength in his bearing that made her realize with dawning comprehension that his illness had been, if not entirely fabricated, then certainly far less severe than he had allowed everyone in Ashford to believe. "You lied," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing sound in her ears as blood pounded through her veins in rhythm with the shock and confusion and growing anger that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. "All this time, about everything, your illness, your circumstance, your very identity was false." "Not about everything," Gabriel said carefully, moving into the room with slow deliberation, as though approaching a frightened animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. He closed the door behind him, sealing them together in the small space where his deception had been maintained, and where it now lay exposed between them like a chasm neither knew how to bridge. "My illness was genuine enough, though perhaps not quite as terminal as I allowed Dr. Matthews to diagnose. The consumption that brought me to Ashford seeking cleaner air was real, though I seemed to have recovered more fully than anticipated, probably because the disease was caught earlier than the good doctor realized and treated with rest and proper nutrition, before it could advance to truly dangerous stages. But you are the Duke of Thornwood," Claire stated flatly, needing to hear him confirm what the documents had already revealed, needing him to speak the truth aloud, even though part of her wished desperately that some other explanation might exist, that the evidence before her eyes might somehow be explained away as another case of mistaken identity or elaborate confusion. "One of the wealthiest and most powerful men in England, which means that I, the scorned seamstress of Ashford, whom everyone pitied for throwing away her youth on a dying stranger, am actually a duchess, though no one knows it, though everyone continues to mock me for a fool, while I unknowingly hold a title that would force them all to bow and curtsy if the truth were revealed." Pain flashed across Gabriel's features, genuine distress at her bitterness, and anger replacing the careful neutrality he had maintained during their confrontation thus far. "That was never my intention, Claire. I never meant to expose you to ridicule or to use your difficult circumstances for my own purposes without proper consideration for how my deceptions might affect you." Claire turned back to the writing desk, her hands gripping its edge as though she needed physical support to remain upright in the face of revelations that had fundamentally altered her understanding of her marriage and her husband. "Then what was your intention? Why come to Ashford at all? Why hide your identity and live in this cottage when you could command the finest accommodations anywhere in England? Why propose marriage to a struggling seamstress when you could have your choice of the most eligible women in society? Women who would bring wealth and connections and beauty to the union, rather than merely poverty and scandal." Gabriel moved to stand behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the faint scent of soap and something distinctly masculine that she had come to associate with his presence. "After my wife died 3 years ago," he began, his voice low and weighted with emotions he rarely displayed, "the endless parade of ambitious mothers and calculating debutantes became unbearable. Every introduction, every conversation, every social engagement was poisoned by my title and wealth. No one saw me. They saw only the Duke of Thornwood, the prize to be won, the fortune to be secured, the connections to be exploited. I desperately wanted to escape, to discover whether anyone might value me for myself, rather than for what I could provide them." He paused, and Claire could hear him draw a shaking breath before continuing. "When illness struck and physicians recommended country air, I saw an opportunity to disappear, to live simply in some place where no one knew my face or title, where I might be judged by my character rather than my rank. I chose Ashford precisely because it was small and isolated enough that news of the Duke of Thornwood's movements would never penetrate its boundaries, where I could simply be Mr. Ashworth, gentleman invalid, and observe how people treated someone they believed to possess no power or advantage. "So this was all an experiment?" Claire asked, her voice sharp with hurt and anger that she no longer attempted to conceal or moderate. "You were testing humanity's capacity for kindness, conducting some aristocratic social investigation, while I became your unwitting subject, the foolish seamstress who could be counted on to show charity to a dying stranger." "No." Gabriel's hand touched her shoulder, tentative and gentle despite the force of his denial. "That is not what I meant, not how it was. Yes, I came to Ashford seeking escape and anonymity, but I never intended to involve anyone else in my deception. The marriage proposal was not part of any plan or experiment. It emerged from genuine need, and what I can only describe as recognition." Claire turned to face him, forcing him to meet her gaze directly, refusing to let him hide behind careful words or diplomatic explanations. "Recognition of what, precisely?" "Of you," he said simply, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that her breath catch despite her anger. "And in all of Ashford, during my months of observation and anonymous residence, you alone showed consistent kindness without agenda or expectation of reward. You mended that chimney sweep's coat when he could not pay and did not know you had witnessed his embarrassment. You shared your bread with the widow Chambers when you thought no one was watching, and you yourself barely had enough to sustain yourself. You treated everyone with the same respect and dignity, regardless of their station or their ability to offer you anything in return." Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks, both from the unexpected compliments and from the realization that Gabriel had been watching her far longer than she had known, observing her actions when she believed herself unobserved, forming judgments about her character while concealing his own true nature behind carefully maintained fiction. "That does not excuse your deception," she said, though her voice had lost some of its sharp edge, softening slightly in response to the evident sincerity in his explanation, even as she struggled to maintain appropriate anger at his dishonesty. "No," Gabriel agreed quietly, his hand still resting on her shoulder in a touch that seemed to anchor them both amid the turbulence of revelation and confrontation. "It does not excuse anything, but perhaps it explains why I could not bear the thought of dying alone, or worse, of recovering alone, without having experienced genuine human connection, untainted by knowledge of my title and wealth. And why? When I realized my feelings for you were growing into something far deeper than mere gratitude for companionship, I found myself paralyzed between the desire to reveal the truth and the fear that such revelation would destroy whatever authentic regard you had developed for the man you believed me to be." Silence stretched between them, thick with implications and unspoken possibilities. Claire's mind raced through the ramifications of Gabriel's revelations, understanding now so many small mysteries and unexplained details that had puzzled her during their brief marriage. The quality of his speech and bearing that seemed inconsistent with his claimed modest origins. The books on his shelf that suggested education far beyond what a gentleman of limited means might possess. The way he instinctively expected deference even while deliberately cultivating an appearance of weakness and dependence. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer, but needing to know what future awaited her now that the truth had emerged and could not be hidden again. "Do you return to London to reclaim your position and your life? Do you simply walk away from this cottage and this marriage as though it were some temporary diversion that has run its course?" Gabriel's hand moved from her shoulder to gently cup her face, tilting it upwards so she had no choice but to meet his gaze, to see the vulnerability and hope and fear that played across features no longer masked by the fatigue of illness or the careful neutrality of concealment. That depends entirely on you, Claire. I have recovered sufficiently to resume my duties as Duke of Thornwood. The estate requires my attention. There are matters of business and politics that cannot be indefinitely postponed, responsibilities to tenants and communities that depend on proper management of Thornwood lands and resources. I must return to London, must reclaim my public identity and all the obligations that accompany me. He hesitated, and Claire saw emotions chase across his face too quickly to identify individually, but which collectively spoke of deep uncertainty about what he was about to propose. You could come with me as my Duchess, take your rightful place in society as the Duchess of Thornwood, with all the privileges and responsibilities that position entails. Or, and here his voice dropped even lower, became almost pleading in a way that seemed entirely at odds with the commanding aristocrat he was revealing himself to be. If you find that my deceptions have destroyed any possibility of trust between us, if you cannot forgive the lies I have told, I could provide for you here quietly, establish you with a generous settlement that would ensure your financial security without requiring you to endure the burden of a marriage you entered under. Entirely false pretenses, and might now prefer to escape. The offer of financial security without the complications of actual marriage should have been tempting to someone in Claire's circumstances, someone who had accepted his original proposal primarily out of economic desperation rather than romantic inclination. She could take his money, remain in Ashford, or move to some other town where her past would not follow her, live independently with the resources to support herself comfortably, without subjecting herself to the demands and scrutiny of aristocratic society, or the complexities of navigating a relationship built initially on deception, even if it had evolved into something more genuine during their brief cohabitation. Yet Claire found herself unexpectedly wounded by the suggestion, hurt by the implication that she might prefer a clean break and generous compensation over the far more complicated prospect of continuing their marriage now that its terms had been so radically altered by revelation of Gabriel's true identity and circumstance. "Is that what you want?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral, even as her heart pounded with anxiety. "To dissolve our arrangement, now that it no longer serves your purposes, now that you have had your experiment in anonymous living and are ready to resume your proper station, is it easier to buy me off with money than to deal with the complications of having a wife who comes from working-class origins and possesses no training or preparation for the role of Duchess?" "No!" Gabriel's vehemence startled her, his hands moving to grip both her shoulders now, as though he needed to physically prevent her from pulling away or misunderstanding his intentions. "That is absolutely not what I want. What I want, what I desperately hope for despite having no right to expect it after my deceptions, is to keep what we have built during these past weeks. Your companionship has become essential to my daily existence, your unwavering spirit that challenges and inspires me in equal measure, your genuine heart that sees people rather than titles or wealth. I want to be your husband in truth, not just in legal documents, and I want you to be my Duchess, not because convention requires it or society expects it, but because I have come to realize that you are precisely the partner I need, the person who can help me be the man I want to become, rather than merely the Duke I was born to be." Claire studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or strategic calculation, looking for evidence that his pretty words might be merely another form of deception designed to achieve his objectives through different means. But what she found in his expression was naked vulnerability, genuine fear that she might reject his offer and leave him to face his ducal obligations alone, authentic hope that she might choose to remain his wife, despite having every justifiable reason to feel betrayed by his lies and misrepresentation. "The society that scorned me will now be forced to bow," she said slowly, testing how the idea felt on her tongue, contemplating the delicious irony of watching Ashford's judgmental residents discover that the foolish seamstress they had mocked for marrying a dying pauper had actually become one of the most highly ranked women in England. They will smile and simper and pretend they never ridiculed the desperate woman who threw herself away on a sickly stranger with no prospects. Lady Harrington's daughter will have to be courteous to me. Mrs. Pemberton will have to address me as Your Grace when she sees me, and will have to swallow all her cruel observations about my supposed foolishness and greed. Something kindled in Gabriel's eyes at her words. Something that might have been admiration, or approval, or perhaps relief, that she was at least considering the possibility, rather than immediately rejecting it, out of justified anger at his deceptions. "We need not return to Ashford, if the prospect troubles you," he offered quickly. "London awaits, or any of my other estates scattered across 3 counties. We could begin entirely anew in places where no one knows our history, where you would simply be introduced as the Duchess of Thornwood, without anyone knowing about Ashford, or the circumstances of our marriage, or the unusual path that brought us together." Claire moved away from his touch, needing physical distance to think clearly about choices that would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire trajectory of her remaining life. Decisions that could not be made impulsively or while distracted by the magnetic pull she felt toward this complicated man who had hidden his true nature, while somehow revealing aspects of his character that rang more true than any title or social position ever could. She walked to the window where rain had begun to fall again, watching drops trace patterns down glass that had witnessed so many of their quiet conversations and gradual drawing together during the weeks when she had believed him to be dying, and he had been engaged in the complicated process of learning whether anyone could value him for himself rather than for his ducal status. "And if I choose to stay," she said finally, not turning to look at him, but knowing he would hear the shift in her tone, the movement from angry confrontation toward cautious consideration of possibilities she had not allowed herself to imagine during her years as struggling seamstress in a town that offered little opportunity and less compassion. "If I choose to be your Duchess, not in hiding but in full view of everyone, including those in Ashford who deemed me foolish for accepting your proposal, what then? What would my life look like as the Duchess of Thornwood? What would be expected of me beyond merely appearing at social functions and learning which fork to use at formal dinners?" Gabriel crossed the room to stand behind her, his reflection appearing in the rain-streaked window glass alongside hers, their images overlapping in ways that seemed symbolically significant given the conversation they were navigating. "You would be the mistress of 6 estates, responsible for their management, and for the welfare of hundreds of tenants and servants who depend on Thornwood resources for their livelihood. You would have considerable influence in society, could use your position to support causes you care about, could make a real difference in people's lives through charity work and patronage. You would have more wealth than you could possibly spend, would never again worry about affording coal for heat or bread for sustenance, would never again face the kind of economic desperation that made my original proposal seem like a reasonable option, despite its obvious problems and limitations." He paused, and Claire saw his reflection shift as he moved slightly closer without quite touching her. "But more than that, you would have me, for whatever that might be worth, after everything I have concealed and misrepresented. I want to be your husband in every sense, Claire. I want to share, not just a name and legal documents, but a life, a partnership built on honesty, now that my secrets have been revealed. I want to wake beside you and fall asleep knowing you are near. I want to face the challenges and opportunities of my position with you as my advisor and confidant and companion. I want, if you will permit it, to love you as you deserve to be loved, without pretense or calculation, or any ulterior motive beyond the simple fact that you have become essential to my existence in ways I cannot adequately express with mere words." Claire's breath caught at this declaration, at the explicit acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing between them, but which neither had dared name or claim until this moment of crisis and revelation. She turned slowly to face him, finding his expression open and vulnerable in ways she had never witnessed during their weeks of careful companionship and gradual growing closer, while both maintained protective distance from fuller emotional engagement. "I shall need appropriate clothing if I am to be presented as a duchess," she said at last, allowing a small smile to touch her lips, despite the confusion and uncertainty that still swirled through her thoughts, like the rain falling outside their cottage window. One cannot appear in London society wearing homemade woolen dresses and mended stockings, regardless of how practical such garments might be for daily living in a Yorkshire cottage. Gabriel's answering smile transformed his entire face, revealing features she had glimpsed only occasionally during their marriage, when his guard lowered sufficiently to allow genuine pleasure or amusement to show through his carefully maintained invalid's composure. "My dear," he said softly, reaching out to take both her hands in his, holding them with a gentleness that contradicted his obvious strength and vitality, now that he was no longer concealing his recovered health. "You shall have whatever your heart desires. The finest modistas in London, jewels from the Thornwood collection that has been accumulating for generations, carriages and houses, and everything that befits your station as my Duchess." "What my heart desires," Claire replied, tightening her fingers around his and taking the leap of faith that his confessions and pleadings seemed to require if they were to move forward from the foundation of deception towards something more solid and sustainable, "is the genuine affection of the man standing before me, not the Duke with all his wealth and power and privilege, but Gabriel, the person who read to me by candlelight and discussed philosophy and literature as though my opinions mattered, who looked at me as though I was worth seeing rather than merely useful for his purposes. That is what I desire, and it is something no title or fortune can secure if the feeling is not authentic." "The feeling is entirely authentic," Gabriel assured her, pulling her closer until only inches separated them, until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her face and see the grey of his eyes darken with intensity of emotion, no longer concealed behind protective barriers. "I love you, Claire Ashworth, the seamstress who became my wife through the most unusual of arrangements, but who has proven to be exactly the partner I needed, even when I did not realize what I was seeking. Whatever began as deception and convenience has transformed into something far more precious and rare, and I promise you that I will spend the remainder of my life proving myself worthy of the trust you placed in me when you agreed to marry a dying stranger, and the even greater trust you place in me now by choosing to remain married to the very much living Duke who deceived you so thoroughly, while simultaneously revealing more of his true self than he had shown anyone in years." When his lips met hers, it was not the chaste kiss of their wedding ceremony performed before a disapproving minister and his scandalized wife, nor was it the careful goodnight kiss on the cheek that had become their routine during weeks of living as platonic companions rather than true spouses. This kiss held promise and passion, acknowledgement of feelings long suppressed, and hopes for future intimacy that would extend beyond mere companionship into the deeper partnership that true marriage could offer when both parties chose to risk vulnerability and genuine connection. Claire returned his kiss with an enthusiasm that surprised them both, her hands moving from his shoulders to tangle in his dark hair, her body pressing closer to his in ways that violated every rule of proper behavior she had been taught, but which felt entirely natural and right in this moment of revelation and commitment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily and slightly dazed by the intensity of feelings exchanged through that single kiss, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers and laughed quietly, the sound full of relief and joy and wonder at the unexpected path that had brought them to this point. "We should probably begin planning our return to London," he said eventually, though neither made any move to actually step away or resume appropriate distance. "There will be announcements to make, presentations at court, social obligations to fulfill that cannot be postponed indefinitely now that I have recovered and must resume my public duties, and visits to certain establishments in Ashford," Claire added with a hint of wicked satisfaction in her voice. "I find I have a particular desire to purchase fabric from Mrs. Pemberton's shop while wearing my finest Duchess attire, to let her see exactly how mistaken her judgments were about the supposedly desperate seamstress who threw herself away on a dying pauper." Gabriel laughed again, clearly delighting in her spirit and her refusal to simply forgive and forget the cruelties she had endured from people who should have known better than to judge circumstances they could not fully understand. "Then we shall make Ashford our first destination, once you have been properly attired and announced as the Duchess of Thornwood. I confess I will enjoy watching their faces when they realize the truth, though I suspect you will manage the situation with far more grace than they showed you during your weeks of public scorn." As autumn rain continued to fall outside the cottage that had served as sanctuary and concealment for the Duke of Thornwood during his months of anonymous recovery from illness, Claire and Gabriel stood wrapped in each other's arms, contemplating a future that neither had imagined when they first negotiated their practical arrangement based on his supposed impending death and her desperate need for financial security. What had begun as transaction, as strategic escape from unbearable social pressures on his part and economic survival on hers, had transformed through daily proximity and gradual recognition of mutual value into something far more precious, a genuine partnership that transcended the usual calculations of aristocratic marriage to achieve the rare combination of practical advantage and authentic affection that most couples never discovered, regardless of how promising their circumstances or conventional their courtship. The Thornwood estate sprawled across the Derbyshire countryside like something from a fairy tale, an imposing manor house of honey-coloured stone with more windows than Claire could easily count, surrounded by gardens that stretched toward distant parkland and forest in carefully designed vistas that spoke of generations of wealth and aristocratic privilege. As their carriage, bearing the Thornwood ducal crest emblazoned prominently on its doors, rolled to a stop on the curved gravel drive before the main entrance, Claire felt her breath catch in her throat, momentarily overwhelmed by the sheer scale and grandeur that awaited her, by the realization that she was now mistress of this magnificent property and all it represented. "Welcome home, Your Grace," said the butler, opening the carriage door with a formal bow that made his spine nearly perpendicular to the ground, his elderly face betraying only the slightest hint of surprise at his first glimpse of the new Duchess, though his training prevented any more obvious reaction to discovering that his employer had returned from Yorkshire with a wife no one had known existed until the announcements began circulating through London society 3 days prior. "And may I be the first to welcome Her Grace the Duchess to Thornwood?" "Thank you, Morrison," Gabriel replied, helping Claire descend from the carriage with a hand at her elbow that steadied her against both her nervousness and the genuine physical challenge of managing the elaborate travelling costume he had commissioned from London's most fashionable modiste, yards of forest green silk and matching pelisse that made her feel simultaneously elegant and slightly ridiculous, as though she were playing dress-up in someone else's life rather than inhabiting her own. Transformed circumstance. "Please inform the staff that the Duchess and I will take tea in the morning room. We have had a long journey and would appreciate some refreshment before beginning the necessary introductions and orientations." As they entered the grand foyer, with its black and white marble floor laid out in intricate geometric patterns and sweeping double staircase that curved upward toward the first floor, like something from a theatrical production, Claire felt the weight of countless aristocratic gazes, the painted eyes of Gabriel's ancestors staring down at her from gilded frames, as though assessing whether this working-class interloper possessed sufficient worthiness to join their distinguished lineage. Her travelling costume, though the finest she had ever owned and professionally tailored to current fashion standards, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate when compared to the evident wealth on display in every architectural detail and decorative element surrounding her. "They are just paintings," Gabriel murmured, noticing her discomfort with the perception that seemed to come naturally to him now that he had acknowledged his feelings and stopped hiding behind protective emotional distance. "And none of them were half as admirable as you, whatever their titles or accomplishments might have been in their own lifetime." The morning room, where tea had been laid out with impressive speed by servants who clearly understood their duties without requiring detailed instruction, proved less intimidating than the formal public spaces. A comfortable chamber decorated in warm yellows and soft blues, with windows overlooking gardens, even in late autumn, retained considerable beauty and interest through careful planning and horticultural expertise. As they took tea from delicate china cups that probably cost more than Claire had earned in an entire year at the dress shop, Gabriel explained the responsibilities that would now fall to her as Duchess of Thornwood, the management of 6 different estates and their associated household, the social obligations that the season would bring when they travelled to London for Parliament and society events, the charitable organisations that traditionally received patronage from the Thornwood dukes and duchesses. "Lord and Lady Ashford are hosting their annual autumn ball next week," he said, setting down his cup and reaching across the small table to take her hand, a gesture of affection that came more naturally to him now that they had moved past the walls of careful distance that had characterized their early relationship. "It would be an appropriate occasion to introduce you properly to society, to present you as the Duchess of Thornwood before the assembled aristocracy, so that when we attend other functions throughout the season, you will have been officially recognized and accepted into their ranks." Claire nearly choked on her tea, setting the cup down with less grace than etiquette probably required. "Next week, Gabriel? I am hardly prepared to face hundreds of England's most elite and judgmental members armed only with a few days of instruction in which fork to use and how to address a marquess versus an earl. Can we not delay somewhat, give me time to study and practice, and feel less like an imposter wearing borrowed clothing?" Gabriel's expression softened with understanding and affection. "You are far more prepared than you realize, my dear. You possess natural dignity and intelligence that no amount of training could instill if the foundation were not already present. Your instincts for kindness and authentic connection will serve you better than perfect knowledge of arbitrary rules that change with fashion and whim anyway. But if you prefer, we could postpone our social debut, allow you more time to accustom yourself to your new circumstances before subjecting yourself to society's scrutiny." "No," Claire said, straightening her shoulders in unconscious imitation of the aristocratic bearing she had observed in the portraits lining Thornwood's entrance hall, drawing on reserves of courage she had developed during years of enduring Ashford's judgment and maintaining dignity, despite reduced circumstances and public scorn. "The longer we delay, the more speculation will grow about why the Duke of Thornwood has suddenly produced a wife from obscure origins whom no one has ever heard of or met in any social context. Better to face them directly and establish my position before rumors and gossip create narratives we would then need to counter or correct." Admiration brightened Gabriel's features as he studied her across the tea table. "Then we shall attend the Ashford ball and introduce you to society with all the ceremony and recognition your position deserves. We will need to summon dressmakers and jewelers, provide you with a wardrobe befitting a duchess, and access to the family collection of gems that tradition dictates you wear as the current holder of my title and name." The following week passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Claire simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated, overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of information and skills she was expected to absorb, while also discovering unexpected satisfaction in the intellectual challenges and social complexities of. A parade of servants provided instruction in the elaborate etiquette that governed aristocratic interaction, which forms of address applied to which ranks, how to navigate seating arrangements at formal dinners, the proper procedures for receiving guests and managing household staff, the expected patterns of charitable work and social patronage that gave aristocratic women purpose and influence beyond merely ornamental presence at fashionable events. Through it all, Gabriel remained supportive and encouraging, his health continuing to improve as though the weight of deception and the stress of maintaining his false identity had been the true illness afflicting him more than any physical disease. He joined her for lessons when his ducal duties permitted, offered private tutoring in the family history and political alliances that shaped Thornwood's position in society, shared intimate dinners where they could speak freely without the formality that public roles required, and gradually introduced physical affection beyond the chaste companionship that had characterized their Yorkshire marriage, building slowly toward the fuller intimacy that marriage typically entailed, but which they had postponed during his supposed terminal illness and their initial practical arrangement. On the evening of the Ashford ball, Claire stood before her dressing room mirror, barely recognizing the elegant figure reflected back at her. The woman in the glass wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out highlights in her dark hair and made her hazel eyes appear almost luminous, its bodice adorned with intricate beading that caught candlelight with every breath and movement. Around her throat rested a necklace of diamonds and sapphires that Morrison the butler had informed her was called the Thornwood constellation, worn by duchesses for 6 generations and worth more than everything Claire had owned in her entire previous life combined. "You look magnificent," came Gabriel's voice from the doorway of her dressing room, and Claire turned to find him resplendent in formal evening attire that transformed him completely from the invalid gentleman she had married in Ashford into the commanding Duke of Thornwood, whose presence would dominate any gathering he attended. The sickly pallor and stooped posture had vanished entirely, replaced by vital health and natural aristocratic bearing that probably came from generations of breeding and training to command rather than obey, to lead rather than follow. "I am terrified," Claire admitted, allowing herself to be vulnerable with him in ways she would never display to the servants or to society, trusting him with her genuine feelings rather than presenting only the composed facade that her position seemed to require. "What if I make some terrible error, use the wrong form of address, or commit some breach of etiquette that marks me as common and unworthy of my position?" Gabriel crossed to her and took both her hands in his, looking directly into her eyes with intensity that conveyed absolute conviction in what he was about to say. "Remember who you are, Claire. Not just the Duchess of Thornwood, with all the external markers of rank and wealth, but the woman who showed compassion when it brought her nothing but trouble, who faced scorn with dignity that shamed her critics, who married a dying stranger out of kindness rather than calculation. You possess more genuine nobility in your character than most of the aristocrats we will encounter tonight possess in their entire lineage, regardless of how ancient their titles or how pure their bloodlines." The moment hung between them, weighted with emotion and unspoken understanding, and then Gabriel raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm through the silk of her elegant glove, a gesture more intimate than the circumstances seemed to warrant, but which felt entirely natural, given how far they had travelled together from suspicious convenience to genuine partnership. "Shall we face the lions together, Your Grace?" he asked, offering his arm with theatrical gallantry that made her smile despite her nervousness. Claire took a steadying breath, drawing on every lesson in deportment and composure she had absorbed during her crash course in aristocratic and placed her hand on his sleeve with a grace she had not known she possessed. "Together, Your..." The Ashford ballroom fell into stunned silence as they were announced, hundreds of candles illuminating the shock on faces of England's elite as the majordomo's voice rang out. "His Grace, the Duke of Thornwood, and Her Grace the Duchess of Thornwood." Claire held her head high as they descended the curved staircase into the ballroom, acutely aware of every eye fixed on them, of the whispers that erupted like a swarm of disturbed bees, as society attempted to process the shocking appearance of a duchess no one had known existed until 3 days ago, when the marriage announcements had appeared in all the London papers. Who is she? Where did she come from? I have never seen her before in any social context. How did Thornwood manage to marry without anyone knowing he was even courting? She must be someone of consequence. But I cannot place her family. The speculations swirled around them as Gabriel guided her through the crowd with easy authority, stopping before their hosts with the assurance of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy any space or command any gathering. "Lord and Lady Ashford," Gabriel said, with formal courtesy that managed to convey warmth despite its proper distance. "May I present my wife, Claire, Duchess of Thornwood? I apologize for the surprise of our marriage, but circumstances required some discretion during my recovery from illness, and I am pleased to now introduce her properly to society." Lady Ashford recovered first, dropping into a curtsy that protocol demanded, though her expression suggested she resented having to acknowledge someone whose origins she could not trace or verify. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure to welcome you to our home. We had not known of Thornwood's marriage plans, and the announcement certainly created considerable interest throughout society." "The pleasure is mine, Lady Ashford," Claire replied, summoning every lesson in proper speech and deportment to ensure her response would be unimpeachable despite her working-class origins. "Your home is as beautiful as my husband described, and I am grateful for your hospitality in welcoming us this evening." As they moved through the ballroom, accepting congratulations and enduring barely concealed curiosity from nobles who struggled to place her in any known family or social context, Claire felt the weight of every stare and whispered speculation. Then across the room she spotted a face that sent a jolt of recognition through her. Lady Harrington's younger daughter, the same young woman who had mocked her in the Ashford market for selling herself cheaply to a dying pauper. The girl stood frozen, colour draining from her face as she realised that the scorned seamstress she had ridiculed now outranked everyone in her family and commanded social precedence at every gathering. "Shall we dance?" Gabriel asked, squeezing her hand reassuringly as the orchestra struck up a waltz, that scandalous dance that had become acceptable in recent years, but which still carried overtones of intimacy that made it popular with young couples and controversial with conservative chaperones. The other couples stepped aside, creating a space for the Duke and Duchess of Thornwood at the centre of the floor, their deference to rank making Claire simultaneously grateful for the honour and uncomfortable with being the focus of such intense observation and assessment. Gabriel led her into the waltz with practised grace, and Claire followed his lead, drawing on both her natural sense of rhythm and the dancing lessons that had occupied several afternoons during her week of intensive preparation, finding that her body remembered more than her anxious mind had given her credit for. "They are waiting for me to fail," she whispered to Gabriel as they turned in perfect synchronization, "to trip over my hem or display my ignorance of proper protocol in some spectacularly public manner that will confirm all their suspicions about my unworthiness for the position I now hold. Then they will be disappointed," he replied firmly, his hand warm and steady against the small of her back, anchoring her against her nervousness and the scrutiny that pressed against them from every direction. "For you are conducting yourself with perfect grace and natural dignity that no amount of breeding could guarantee if the essential character were not already present. You are the most genuine person in this room of pretenders and poseurs, and that authenticity is worth more than all their accumulated bloodlines and ancient titles." But as they danced, surrounded by England's aristocratic elite, who had scorned her in ignorance, and who now watched with mixture of curiosity, envy, and reluctant acceptance, something shifted within Claire, a transformation from someone playing a role to someone inhabiting her new identity with increasing confidence and ownership. She was not pretending to be a duchess, while secretly remaining the struggling seamstress from Ashford. She was actually becoming the Duchess of Thornwood, integrating her past experiences and essential character into her new position, rather than abandoning who she had been in order to conform to aristocratic expectations. In Gabriel's arms, she found not just the security and status that their practical arrangement had promised, but genuine partnership and growing love that transformed their marriage from convenient fiction into authentic relationship built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep understanding that develops when two people risk vulnerability despite every reason to maintain protective distance. The journey from suspicious convenience to devoted partnership had been neither smooth nor simple, marked by deception and revelation, hurt feelings and gradual healing, but somehow they had navigated the complicated terrain to arrive at something precious and rare, a marriage that satisfied both practical needs and emotional longing, that combined advantage with genuine affection in ways that most aristocratic unions never achieved, regardless of how promising their initial circumstances or conventional their courtship. Spring had transformed Thornwood's extensive gardens into a riot of colour and fragrance, tulips and daffodils giving way to roses and peonies as the season advanced towards summer, painting the landscape in vibrant hues that seemed to mirror the changes in the household and in the marriage that had begun under such unusual circumstances. Claire stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens, watching as Gabriel moved among the flower beds below, his conversation with the head gardener animated and clearly full of strong opinions about plantings and pruning. His complete health and vitality, now taken for granted by everyone who had witnessed his transformation from supposed invalid to active and engaged master of multiple estates. 6 months had passed since her dramatic introduction to London society, 6 months during which Claire had not merely survived aristocratic scrutiny, but had actively thrived in her new role, discovering unexpected satisfaction in the influence and opportunities that her position provided. Her background in dressmaking had evolved naturally into patronage of schools for young women seeking respectable trades, educational initiatives that provided practical skills and economic independence for girls who might otherwise face the same desperate circumstances that had characterized Claire's own life before her improbable. The charity work had earned grudging respect, even from society's most critical members, who found themselves forced to acknowledge the new Duchess of Thornwood as something more than merely the mysterious woman of unknown origins who had somehow captured one of England's most eligible bachelors during his mysterious absence from society. "Your Grace," said Morrison, appearing at her elbow with a silver salver bearing correspondence that had arrived with the morning post. "Several letters requiring your attention, including one from Yorkshire that appears to be from the town of Ashford." Claire thanked him and took the letters, her heart quickening slightly at the mention of her former home, wondering what news or request might have prompted someone from Ashford to write to the Duchess of Thornwood. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter, discovering it was from the minister's wife, Miss Williams, informing her that the widow Chambers had fallen seriously ill and faced eviction from her small cottage due to accumulated debts she could not possibly pay, given her advanced age and complete lack of resources or family support. Without hesitation, Claire moved to her writing desk, one of several spaces throughout Thornwood that had been designated as her private territory where she could conduct correspondence and manage the charitable initiatives that had become her particular focus and responsibility. She penned quick instructions to the Thornwood solicitors, directing them to purchase the widow's cottage outright and establish a modest annuity sufficient to ensure Chambers could live out her remaining years in comfort and security, without fear of eviction or a small gesture that would cost the Thornwood estate almost nothing, but would make enormous difference to one elder who had once shared her fire with a freezing seamstress during a particularly harsh week. Gabriel found her there some time later, sealing the letter with the ducal crest that now felt natural beneath her fingers after months of regular use. More charitable works, his voice warm with the affection that no longer required concealment or careful rationing, his love for her evident in every tone and gesture, now that they had moved past initial deception and defensive distances to build genuine partnership. "The widow chambers," Claire explained, looking up from her desk with a smile that came easily these days, no longer forced or strategic, but a natural expression of contentment that had been rare during her years in Ashford, but which had become her default state during months of marriage that had exceeded her most optimistic hopes. "She once helped me when I had nothing to offer in return, and now I find I have resources to ensure she will not suffer the same grinding poverty that threatened to consume me before you made your unusual proposal." Gabriel's expression softened as he moved to stand beside her chair, his hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder in a touch that conveyed both affection and solidarity. "Your memory for past kindnesses continues to humble me, as does your determination to use your position to make tangible differences in people's lives, rather than merely enjoying the privileges that rank and wealth provide, without considering the responsibilities that should accompany such advantages." He paused, and Claire noticed a particular quality to his smile, something that suggested he possessed information he was eager to share, but wanted to prolong the anticipation for his own amusement. "I have received word that Lord and Lady Pemberton will be visiting London next week for the remainder of the season. They have requested an audience, which I found rather interesting, given that they were among Ashford's most vocal critics of our marriage when they believed I was merely dying Mr. Ashworth, with no prospects or resources." Claire raised an eyebrow, immediately understanding the delicious irony of the situation. How very curious that they should now wish to make our acquaintance, now that they have discovered the dying pauper was actually the Duke of Thornwood, and the foolish seamstress is actually the Duchess. One might almost think their opinions about the wisdom of our marriage have been revised in light of changed understanding about our actual circumstances and positions. "Indeed," Gabriel replied, his smile growing more mischievous. "I thought we might invite them to dinner, along with a few other notable residents of Ashford who made their disapproval of our union so publicly clear when they believed we were merely common people making questionable choices. It seems only proper that we should receive them now that they have recognized their error and wish to make amends. Don't you not think? How deliciously wicked of you, Your Grace." Claire laughed, the sound free and genuine in ways that would have been impossible during her years of struggling for survival in a town that offered little opportunity and less compassion. "One might almost think you are enjoying the reversal of fortunes and the opportunity to watch those who judged us so harshly now scramble to curry favour and pretend they never doubted the wisdom of our arrangement." "I confess to some satisfaction," Gabriel admitted, pulling up a chair to sit beside her at the writing desk, abandoning formal distance in favour of the easy intimacy they had developed over months of learning to be actual partners rather than merely cordial strangers sharing a name and residence. "Though my primary joy comes not from their discomfort, but from seeing you recognised and respected as you always deserved, from watching society bow to someone whose worth was evident to me from the beginning, but which required dramatic revelation of my identity to make visible to others who judge only by external markers rather than essential character." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the spring sunshine streaming through the windows and catching on Claire's rings, the simple gold band she had received in the Ashford cottage, now joined by an elaborate ducal ring set with diamonds and sapphire, though it was the simpler band that she valued most, for it represented the beginning of their unusual journey and the foundation of trust and regard that had eventually flowered into genuine love, despite originating in deception and, practical necessity. "I have news," Claire said softly, reaching out to take his hand, guiding it to rest against her abdomen in a gesture whose meaning would be immediately clear to him. News that may once again set tongues wagging throughout London society, though for rather different reasons than our marriage initially inspired. "Du," understanding dawned in Gabriel's eyes, followed immediately by joy so profound that it transformed his features completely, erasing the last traces of the careful control and emotional distance that had once characterized his interactions before Claire had taught him that vulnerability could be strength rather than weakness. "Truly?" he asked, his voice catching with emotion he made no attempt to conceal or moderate. "You are certain? The physician confirmed it yesterday," Claire replied, watching his face with delight at witnessing such unguarded happiness from someone who had spent years maintaining protective barriers against feeling too deeply or caring too much. "The Thornwood line will continue, it seems, though I suspect society will count backward and whisper about whether proper time has elapsed since our wedding, not realizing that what appeared to be a hasty marriage was actually the culmination of months of growing regard, even if the relationship began under less conventional circumstances than most aristocratic unions." Joy overwhelmed his usual restraint entirely, and in one swift movement, Gabriel pulled her from her chair into his arms, lifting her off her feet, in an embrace that communicated volumes about the depth of feeling he no longer attempted to hide or ration. "My remarkable Claire," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion, "you have given me far more than I dared hope for when I crafted my ill-conceived plan to escape my ducal responsibilities and discover whether anyone might value me for myself rather than my title. You have given me authentic partnership, genuine love, and now a future that extends beyond merely fulfilling obligations into actually building something meaningful and lasting." "As have you," Claire replied, thinking of the lonely seamstress she had been just months earlier, scorned by society and surviving on scraps of work and occasional charity, believing her prospects limited to permanent spinsterhood, or perhaps eventually succumbing to the grinding poverty that claimed so many women of her class. "Though I maintain that next time you might simply introduce yourself properly from the start, without requiring elaborate deceptions and false identities to discover whether someone might care for you, independent of your wealth and rank." Gabriel's laughter rang through the sunlit room as he set her gently back on her feet, his hands cradling her face with the tender reverence of someone who has found something precious beyond measure and fears it might somehow be damaged by careless handling. "Next lifetime, I promise complete honesty from the beginning, though I rather think we have made the most of this life despite its unusual beginning. Would you not agree?" "I would," Claire agreed, and as his lips met hers in a kiss that held promise of their shared future, she silently acknowledged the truth that their journey had validated, that sometimes the most meaningful relationships emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that practical arrangements can transform into profound partnerships when both parties possess courage to be vulnerable, and that the seamstress who had married a supposedly dying stranger had discovered something far more valuable than financial security. She had found genuine love with a man who saw and valued her true self, rather than merely her usefulness or her willingness to accept his terms without question or complaint. Outside the windows, spring continued its triumphant transformation of the Thornwood gardens, much as love had transformed the seamstress and her duke, healing old wounds and creating new life, where once there had been only loneliness, deception, and the desperate measures that poverty and fear inspire in those who lack better options or clearer understanding of what the future might hold. Sometimes the most extraordinary transformations begin with the most ordinary desperation. Claire accepted Gabriel's proposal not because she recognized him as a duke in disguise, but because she faced the grim reality of a world that offered women like her precious few options beyond poverty or dependence. and marrying a dying stranger seemed marginally preferable to either alternative. What she could not have known, what neither of them could have anticipated, was that their practical arrangement would become the foundation for something far more rare and valuable, a marriage that combined material security with genuine emotional connection, that satisfied both pragmatic needs and deeper longings for authentic partnership and mutual regard. Perhaps you recognize yourself in Claire's situation, facing choices that seem limited by circumstances beyond your control, accepting arrangements that appear merely strategic or convenient because better options remain frustratingly out of reach. Perhaps you have learned, as she did, that sometimes the most practical decisions can lead unexpectedly toward the most profound satisfactions, that choosing wisely among limited options can open doors you never imagined existed. Or perhaps you see yourself in Gabriel, hiding your true identity and authentic self behind protective barriers, testing whether anyone might value you for who you actually are, rather than what you can provide or what advantages association with you might offer, seeking connection that transcends calculation even as you engage in elaborate deceptions to create conditions where such genuine regard might emerge. May you find the courage to be vulnerable despite excellent reasons for maintaining protective distance. May you recognize that practical considerations need not preclude emotional depth, that arranged marriages can transform into love matches when both parties remain open to growth and change. May you understand that worthiness is not determined by birth or circumstances, but by character and choices, by how you treat those who cannot advance your interests or enhance your status. And may you discover, as Claire and Gabriel, that sometimes the person you marry out of necessity becomes the person you cannot imagine living without, that convenience can evolve into devotion, and that the most improbable arrangements can yield the most precious results when approached with honesty, respect, and willingness to see beyond surface presentations to recognize the genuine worth that lies beneath.